He had been a quiet man once, content to live in the shadows of his own small world. A mechanic by trade, his hands bore the grease of long hours spent fixing other people's machines, while his heart carried the steady rhythm of a man who had little but enough. He wasn't ambitious, not in the way men with sharp suits and sharper smiles were. He wanted nothing more than peace, his mother's fading laughter preserved in memory, and the dignity of honest work. But peace was fragile. It shattered the day the law came for him. It started with whispers, then accusations, until the police arrived with iron certainty and a warrant that read like a verdict already passed. They said he was guilty of a crime he had not committed. They said his fingerprints were on evidence he had never touched. They said the witnesses had seen him, though their eyes had been led astray by promises whispered in smoky back rooms. He tried to speak, tried to scream the truth, but the gavel struck louder than his voice. The system swallowed him whole, and in its cold stomach, he sat for years, watching the bars of his cell carve lines into his soul. It wasn't the time that broke him. It was the betrayal. He had believed in the law, believed that justice, though flawed, tilted toward truth in the end. But he came to see it wasn't truth that mattered, it was power. The prosecutor with ambition to climb higher, the detectives eager to close a case, the witnesses desperate for their own survival. He was just the scapegoat, the sacrifice dressed in chains, offered up so the machinery of justice could keep spinning. The years burned away, and something in him hardened. He stopped begging. He stopped hoping. In the silence of his nights, he began to plan. Revenge was no longer just a thought. It became the marrow in his bones. Not the kind of revenge that spilled blood in alleys or lashed out in rage. No, his revenge would be precise, patient, and undeniable. He would use the very thing that had destroyed him, the justice system itself. He studied the law from inside the belly of the beast. Every statute, every precedent, every crack in the foundation. The prison library became his sanctuary, the weight of dusty books his only allies. He learned the language of judges, the strategy of lawyers, the art of dismantling arguments thread by thread. Years later, when the courts finally granted him a hearing, more a formality than a chance, he stood there, not as the broken man they thought he'd be, but as something sharper, honed by fury and intellect. He proved his innocence, piece by piece, tearing apart their manufactured evidence until even the judge could no longer deny what had been done to him. He walked out free but not whole. Freedom was not enough. The world outside had moved on without him, but he had not forgotten. He traced the lines back, every hand that had pushed him down, every signature that had sealed his fate. The detective who planted evidence, now retired and enjoying the comfort bought with corruption. The prosecutor, now a rising politician, speaking of justice with a smile that had condemned an innocent man. The witnesses who had lied, their own sins buried deep. They thought time would erase their sins, but time had only sharpened his memory. One by one, he began to dismantle them, not with guns or fists, but with the same cold machinery they had used against him. He leaked documents, exposing the detectives' decades of misconduct, the bribes tucked neatly into shadows. The man who had once worn a badge now faced the humiliation of stripped honors, his name dragged through the headlines. The prosecutor, once untouchable, found his past cases unraveling as whispers turned into investigations. Convictions overturned, victims stepping forward, the carefully built tower of his career collapsing in the glare of truth. He confronted the witnesses too, not with threats, but with evidence. He exposed their perjury, their deals, their cowardice. Their names became synonymous with falsehood, their lives unraveling in the court of public opinion. Each move was meticulous, each strike cutting deeper than any blade could. He became a ghost in their lives, the reminder that truth was not so easily buried. Some called him a crusader, others a villain. To him, it didn't matter. What mattered was balance. The scales of justice had once been tipped against him, but now he forced them level with his own hands. When it was done, when the detective was disgraced, the prosecutor ruined, and the witnesses silenced by their own shame, he stood alone, not triumphant, but hollow. Revenge had been his fuel, his compass, the thing that had carried him through the dark. Now that it was over, he realized there was no going back to the quiet man he once was. The system had taken that man, broken him, and in his place built something colder. He had fought back and won, but at a cost. Justice was no longer an ideal to him. It was a weapon, and he had learned to wield it with precision. The world would remember him not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as the man who turned the system on itself. And somewhere deep inside, though he would never admit it aloud, he felt a grim satisfaction. They had framed him once, but in the end, he had written the final judgment. He had walked out of prison with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of a dozen years carved into his bones. The air outside tasted different, sharp and free, but it carried no sweetness. Freedom meant little when the scars of injustice still burned beneath the skin. For every brick in the wall that had surrounded him, there was a face he remembered, a detective's cold grin, a prosecutor's smug conviction, a witness's trembling but false testimony. Each one had played their part. Each one had driven the nails into his coffin. And each one would pay. The detective was first. The man had been a legend once, celebrated in the papers for his record-breaking conviction rate. But the truth was filthier. In the shadows of city alleys, he had made deals with criminals, burying their sins in exchange for their silence, planting evidence where it was convenient, and fabricating stories that fit the narrative. It had worked for years. Nobody questioned results when the headlines praised him as a hero. But now, someone was watching. The mechanic-turned-avenger followed the detective's routines, quiet as smoke. He dug into archives, court records, and backroom whispers. It wasn't hard to find the cracks. Cases that made no sense, witnesses who disappeared, statements that contradicted each other. He leaked them carefully, feeding them to journalists who had long grown hungry for scandal. Then he delivered the final blow. Proof of falsified evidence, proof that had once shackled him. Overnight, the decorated officer's name was dragged through the dirt. His medals were stripped, his pension frozen, his career erased. When reporters swarmed his front lawn, the man who once wielded power with arrogance could only cower behind his curtains. Justice, twisted once by his hands, had turned on him. But the detective was only the beginning. The prosecutor was harder. He had risen higher since the trial, now wearing tailored suits and speaking on podiums about integrity and justice. His smile gleamed on television, his words polished like marble. But beneath the surface lay the rot. Cases built on lies, careers destroyed for the sake of ambition. The Avenger studied him like a predator circling prey, gathering whispers from ex-colleagues, tracing financial trails, piecing together the pattern of corruption. Then he struck. A leaked recording here, a forged timeline exposed there, each revelation carefully timed. The prosecutor's past came unraveling like thread pulled from a suit. Old cases reopened, journalists swarming like vultures, victims speaking out. The man's career, once untouchable, collapsed under the weight of his own deceit. He resigned in disgrace, his name no longer spoken with admiration but spit with contempt. The higher he had climbed, the harder he fell. And as the Avenger watched him crumble, he felt only the steady satisfaction of balance restored. The witnesses came next, the ones who had stood in court and damned him with lies. One had been a petty thief, offered a lighter sentence in exchange for pointing a finger. Another had been promised protection, safety, a future, all in exchange for a single nod of the head. They had looked at him with false certainty, sealing his fate with words they knew were untrue. Now, they lived small, forgettable lives, their lies buried in the past. But the past had claws. He visited them one by one, not with violence but with truth. He revealed documents, recordings, evidence of the deals they had struck. Employers learned of their perjury. Families discovered the shame they had hidden. Friends turned their backs. They weren't imprisoned as he had been, but their lives collapsed under the weight of exposure. He didn't need to strike them. He simply pulled away the masks they wore and let the world do the rest. By the time it was over, The Avenger had dismantled every pillar of the injustice that had crushed him. The detective was disgraced, the prosecutor ruined, the witnesses undone. The system that had betrayed him had been forced to eat its own corruption. He stood in the wreckage, not as the man he once was, but as something colder, sharper, forged in fire. And yet, when the dust settled, he found no peace. Revenge had been his fuel, his weapon, his compass, but it left him hollow. There were no cheers, no applause, no comfort. Only silence, heavy and endless. He had fought back, and he had won, but victory tasted of ash. Still, when he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the man who had been framed, broken, and forgotten. He saw a survivor who had forced the world to remember his name. They had written him off as a casualty of justice. But in the end, he had written the final judgment, and it bore only one truth. They had framed him once. They would never forget the price of that mistake. He carried the weight of years like chains, though none were visible anymore. The prison gates had opened. The sky above had stretched wide and endless, but freedom was not the same as peace. Freedom was just another kind of silence, and in that silence he could hear the echoes of every lie told about him, every false word that condemned him. He was not interested in rebuilding a life. That man, the mechanic who fixed engines and dreamed of nothing larger than simple days, was gone. What remained was a man with only one purpose: reckoning. The detective was the first shadow he hunted. The man had been older now, his hair gray, his belly heavy with the comfort of a pension that was not rightfully his. He lived in a quiet suburban house, manicured lawn, a dog that barked when strangers passed. From the outside, he looked like a man who had earned his rest. But the Avenger knew better. He remembered the detective's smirk in court, the way he leaned back as if victory was inevitable. It was inevitable because he had made it so, planting evidence, twisting reports, pressing witnesses until they bent or broke. For weeks, the Avenger followed him, not to harm him, but to watch, to learn. He noted the daily routines, the morning coffee at the corner diner, the afternoon walks with the dog, the evenings when the lights went out at exactly 10. Then he began pulling threads. He tracked down old cases the detective had solved, spoke quietly with families of men who had never come home, dug through archives long forgotten. The truth was there, waiting, dozens of cases that bore the same signature tricks. Evidence that appeared too neatly. Confessions that contradicted themselves. Witnesses who had since disappeared. He brought these truths into the light one by one. Journalists hungry for scandal received manila envelopes in the mail, each one filled with copies of damning reports, each one a nail in the coffin of the detective's reputation. Soon, the man's face was on every screen, not as a hero but as a fraud. He tried to deny it, of course, but the proof was too strong, the accusations too numerous. The world that once praised him now spat on his name. By the time it was finished, the detective lived behind drawn curtains, drowning in shame, abandoned by colleagues, reviled by neighbors. The man who had stolen so many lives now lived as a ghost in his own. The prosecutor required more patience. He was still in the spotlight, a man who had built his career on convictions like trophies. He had turned his justice into a platform, a ladder that carried him into politics. His speeches were polished, his suits tailored, his smile broadcasted into millions of homes. To the public, he was untouchable. To the Avenger, he was simply next. The attack was not loud but precise. Financial records, campaign contributions, backroom deals, all carefully traced and revealed. Allies became enemies when their names were dragged into scandal. Old clients, once forgotten, suddenly came forward, emboldened by the revelations. Every move the prosecutor had made to climb higher was now a step dragging him down. At the height of it, recording surfaced, his voice, cold and calculating, speaking of the trial years ago, mocking the innocence of the man he had condemned. That tape spread like wildfire. Overnight, his career was incinerated. He resigned in disgrace, his face hollow, his ambitions crumbling to ash. The witnesses were smaller prey, but no less deserving. They had been ordinary people, desperate for their own survival, willing to sell a man's life for safety or favor. They had spoken with trembling voices in court, sealing his fate with lies. Now, years later, they thought themselves forgotten. But he found them. One was a man who worked nights as a security guard, another a woman who had changed her name and tried to bury the past. To each, he appeared with evidence of what they had done: signed deals, transcripts, recordings. He did not threaten them. He simply revealed their truth to the world. Employers cast them out, families turned cold, neighbors whispered. They carried the shame like a brand. It was not prison, but it was its own kind of cage. One by one, the pillars of the lie collapsed. And when they were gone, when all that was left was silence, he stood in the ruins of what he had built. Not triumph, not joy, only silence. He had won, but victory was a hollow thing. He had taken back what was stolen, had turned the machine of justice against itself. Yet there was no redemption waiting for him, no return to who he had once been. In the quiet of his nights, he sometimes wondered if he had become the very thing he hated. He had not planted evidence, had not lied, had not broken men with falsehoods, but he had destroyed them nonetheless. Perhaps justice was never about truth. Perhaps it was only about power, about who held it and who did not. And yet, he felt something deep inside, something grim and unyielding. Satisfaction. They had framed him once. They had buried him alive. And he had clawed his way back, dragging them into the grave they had dug. The world forgot many things, but they would not forget him. Not now. Not ever.